Hey folks, week 9. Oh my goodness, oh my goodness. So we are getting through a lot of interesting material here. I hope you enjoyed this week's material. I really personally, I mean, maybe I think it's all interesting, but there's a lot of relevance in this material this week. You've got your GMOs, which are relevant to people's lives. And we've got, of course, the vaccines. There's an assignment on vaccines. So note that when you're going into this module for this week, there are 2 lecture assignments to submit. Neither one of them is going to take you a whole lot of time, but they're to get you thinking about some of these important issues. Um, the one about vaccines is not due until Sunday, but just go ahead and do that one. It's not hard, and it's probably a good time to do it right now so that you can focus on that information and then move on to your evolution and natural selection. So, what I'd recommend if you haven't started doing these assignments yet is do that COVID-19 vaccines assignment. It's relevant to what's going on in the world right now with the vaccines becoming more widespread and available. And we were just talking about how if you work for educational institutions, like if you are an employee at SBCC or any other educational institution, you're even if you're part-time, you are probably eligible to get these vaccines right now. So check in California or check wherever you are in the world and see what your eligibility is. You might be able to get the vaccine. I'm getting mine on Saturday morning. So got my Saturday morning plans, going to the hospital, getting my first dose. Um, are there any questions about that vaccines assignment? I know a lot of the people who are here with me have already done that. Okay. Good. It just has some videos to watch and answer the questions about those. There's also this assignment. What do you know about evolution? And it's a survey, it's graded, but you can take it as many times as you want. If you don't get the answers correct the first time, you will see that and you will have an indication of what the correct answer is. So, really, by Friday, when this is due, I expect to look at my grade sheet and see a whole string of fives that everybody in this class has done that, and everybody in this class has 5 out of 5. You can take it as many times as you want to get that score. You'll see a theme to the answers to the questions. You do want to pay attention to those answers because that will probably be something that I'll also say you need to know for your exam. Are all of these questions about it's based on some assumptions we have about how evolution works. So make sure you complete that by Friday. The COVID-19 vaccine assignment is due Sunday, but just go ahead and do it. Get it out of the way. You don't need to be worried about doing that over the weekend if you've got time to do it this week. And then our lecture material, the slides on GMOs were posted last week, but we're going to just look at this one question. It already came up about what is a GMO. And the question was, is that all we need to know from that lecture on GMOs? And yeah, actually, usually in class we have a discussion about genetically modified organisms. What is a GMO? How would you define that? I just said it stands for, you should definitely know what it stands for, right? Which is genetically modified organisms. But more importantly, I think, what does that mean? Like, if I get a mutation in my DNA, am I a GMO? No, I'm not, right? How could I become a genetically modified organism? What would have to happen to genetically modify an organism?
I think I might have the answer. Is it like it's an organism whose DNA sequence has been altered purposefully through genetic engineering? Or for example, like it was taken out and something was put in to be like resistant to a certain bug for like plants or something.
Hmm. And where is that other DNA coming from?
Something that is resistant to?
Uh, but is it, for example, to actually for a biological definition of a genetically modified organism, like sometimes there are even targeted mutations done. So what if somebody came in with a laser and targeted and mutated my DNA? Would I be a GMO in this sense? No. That means if I'm a genetically modified organism, That means that DNA has been put into my body from a different species. Okay. So it's not about selective breeding. It's not about artificial selection for certain traits. That is not what we're talking about when we're talking about GMOs. We're talking about, and a lot of times it has to do with bacteria too, right? If we want a bacterium to make a lot of copies of a certain protein so that we can use that protein to treat diabetes by injecting people with human insulin, then that bacterium is a genetically modified organism because it's getting DNA that initially came from humans. But it's using that DNA to make human proteins so that we can treat this disease. That's what it means. Um, and I hope one of the things that you also took away from that GMO lecture, I think one of the main points is that this is a technology, right? And you might have people come out with strong opinions that are pro GMO or anti GMO. And I really encourage you to be critical thinkers and think about the complexities of an issue, that not all genetically modified organisms and not all applications of this technique are the same. So, really, what we probably should be discussing as a society is okay, well, let's look at this application of this technology. Is this an application that we feel comfortable with? Do we think it's safe? Is it okay for the environment? Is it helping more people than it's harming? Is it that? Those are the discussions we have to have. So, I really encourage you to be open minded to being able to see the complexities of these situations instead of being like the people on that Jimmy Kimmel video who just came out with a hard opinion of like, no, I'm anti GMO or I'm pro GMO without even understanding what they were talking about. So that's kind of my job as an instructor, is to get people to understand that issues have, like, there are facts backing up issues. Look at the facts and be informed about what you're looking at. And that's also relevant to the vaccines. Okay. Okay, so Mary, we have a question about question 8. Let's look at this one. The thought question. Great. Why can't natural selection lead to perfect organisms? Let me get your input on that. Tell me about some of the constraints on natural selection.
It's not goal oriented.
Okay, good. So let's think about that. What does it mean that natural selection is not goal oriented? And I'm gonna hang on to that one for a minute too. Um, let's talk about another constraint, and I am definitely going to come back to fitness, Mingyang. Let's talk about another constraint. Does natural selection lead to the creation of new traits? What do you all think?
No.
No, it does not, right? An example that I used from lecture was, if you have a population and that population has yellow flowers and red flowers, that's the variation that's available, right? So natural selection is going to act on those traits. The better of those traits will have an advantage. But what if the best trait is to have purple flowers? Are there any purple flowers there in that population? No. So do you think, would you expect purple flowers to appear in the next generation because purple would be a great trait? Right. So no, right? And I think this is where people get confused about how natural selection works. Let's think about this, okay? If you are a land dwelling species like humans, right? What if the entire continent became, or the entire globe, world became flooded and we didn't have any land available anymore? Would you expect to see in the next generation of humans that have gills? Is that something that you would expect to see?
No.
Because we're not going to be able to survive unless we can maybe potentially even breathe underwater. So are we going to get gills in response to that environmental change? No, we're not, right? We have what we have. The only way to get a new trait is through what process? What process leads to new genetic traits?
Mutation?
Yeah, totally, Christine. It's mutation. The only way to get a new genetic trait is through mutation, and mutations are random changes to our DNA sequences. So we do not get new traits just because they would be good, right? So that's the first part of this. Why can't natural selection lead to perfect organisms? Because it's not a creative process, right? It works with existing variation. If the trait does not exist, then it can't magically occur. It's not just going to magically show up in response to natural selection. Um, and then another thing is, what do we say when we say it's not goal oriented? What does that mean? Like, go back to those flowers that were red and yellow again. Like, maybe in an environment, red is going to be the best trait because the pollinators are really attracted to red. So that flower, that plant's going to have an advantage in survival and reproduction specifically. But is that a goal? Is red the goal? Is it absolutely better? Is that population just on a path toward red, right? Why is that not the goal? What could change things? Is the best trait always the best trait?
It's
Is
just
red
random.
always going to be the best trait?
Um, it's not always the best trait.
It's not, right? But it depends on what. What determines what the best trait is going to be?
Environment.
The environment, absolutely, Young. So yeah, it's environmentally dependent. So a good trait in one environment might be a bad trait in a different environment, and so you don't have this goal oriented thing. And just look at all the diversity of life on Earth, right? So the environment always changes. So we might have a trait right now that's working pretty well, but if the environment changes, that trait might not be good anymore. And even if we did get to a place where the environment were completely stable, um, we can't ever be perfect because that would require that essentially we be designed or that our DNA be manipulated in a way so that it produces a specific type of outcome, which is not how mutations work and which is not how we get new traits. So those are the two big answers to that question. And also thinking about we say that we have historical constraints with respect to evolution. That means that we have adapted or our ancestors evolved under certain environmental conditions. In fact, humans, our ancestors were fish, right? Fish were the ancestors to all vertebrates, and they were in the ocean and they had certain needs as living in an aqueous environment. And we have different needs because we are now on land, we're upright, and we have gravity pulling down on us, and we have notoriously inadequate spinal structures for dealing with walking around being bipedal for our entire lives. That's why almost every human will at some point in their lives experience back pain. But this is the bone structure that we inherited from our ancestors who had a different environment. So we just have what we have, and natural selection, selects for the best trait among the traits that are available, and it's within the context of that environment. So there was also a question about fitness, and there's a question about number 14. So let me go down here and we'll talk about fitness, we'll talk about gene flow, genetic drift, and number 14. Okay, So what is that question? Number 14, what is the ultimate source of all genetic variation? I just mentioned that. What is the process that leads to the creation of new alleles? Minyoung, I'm going to mute you because I think we're getting a little feedback from your from your computer. But if you want to speak up, just unmute yourself. Do that. What is it, folks? What's the ultimate source of variation? It is good. It's mutation, right? Mutation is how we get new alleles. So that red flower color versus the yellow flower color versus potentially at some point a purple flower color, that would have to come about by mutations making changes in the DNA sequences. And that's how you get new alleles. Good. Sexual reproduction, you can see that in question number 13 above. Sexual reproduction leads to, of course, the production of gametes, and that can be a huge diversity of gametes because of independent assortment. Then there's, the diversity of zygotes that get produced as those gametes come together. But that is taking the diversity that's already there with the alleles and just putting it in different combinations. So my favorite way of illustrating this, I think it's on the next thing down. I hope you enjoyed the videos of the birds of paradise and so forth. But my favorite way of illustrating this is that if you look at all of these heads and all of these different structures that you could put together in your veggie heads toy box or whatever, look at the different eye shapes, eye sizes, nose shapes, nose sizes, ear shapes and sizes, head shapes and sizes. Those different options are available because of mutations that have happened in the past, millions to billions of years, like going back to the beginning of life on Earth, right? We have this buildup of genetic variation. But what sexual reproduction does is it allows every individual in the population to be a unique combination of those different options. Right? So you just think about all the alleles that are present might hold potential to have different shaped ears, and then this individual that's produced is going to get one of those options for ear shapes and going to get an independent option for eye shape or size or so forth. And that's all going to go together to create a unique individual. And that's why sexual reproduction is also part of this discussion. All right, let's go back to fitness. We want to know about fitness. Which question is that? Is that one just here in the definitions? Okay, what does it mean? What is biological fitness? And the reason I say this as defined by population geneticists is because I'm not talking about the type of physical fitness you get when you work out every day, that you're building up your heart strength and so forth, your ability to transport oxygen. That's called physical fitness. We're going to talk about that later in the semester. Right now, I'm talking about evolutionary fitness. And we bring this word in because people will often throw around this phrase, survival of the fittest, which Darwin did not say. Survival of the fittest. What does that mean? Well, what actually does fitness mean in the context of population genetics? Fitness is what?
It is as individuals contributing to the gene pool of the next generation relative to other individuals.
Right. So if it's an individual's contribution, I think it's probably up here somewhere. Let's see. Here's my fitness. Aha. What does this mean, right? Because we don't just want to memorize definitions. We want to be able to explain what they mean. Okay. So this means that we've got a contribution to the gene pool of the next generation. How do you make a contribution to the next generation's gene pool? Well, you have offspring, right? So I have my genes and my DNA, and the way that my genes are going to make it to the next generation is through the offspring that I produce. And they'll get, because I'm a sexually reproducing species, they will get approximately 50% of my genes. So you would then kind of look at across the population who's the individual in the population that is giving the most genes to the next generation, or who's producing the most offspring. Typically, that's going to be a male because sperm are much more easily produced, and males don't have to go through gestation and laying the eggs and holding on to the eggs. And so there tends to be this potential difference in the reproductive potential of males. Like they could have 30, 40 offspring, right? Potentially. Whereas females are limited by their ability to give birth and so forth. But anyway, that's usually not what we're talking about. We're talking about usually in humans somewhere between 0 and maybe, up to as many as 9 or 10 offspring. Someone who has more offspring will have a higher relative fitness. So the person who has the most offspring and has passed on the most genes will have a relative fitness of 1, and then everybody else is relative to that. This is just how we define essentially which genes are being passed on in the population. It tends to be a lot less relevant to human populations and societies because, we have lots of freedom of choice. In most cases, we can decide, well, actually, I don't really want to have kids. That's not really my jam or the way that I want to live my life. Maybe I do. Maybe I want to have 2, 3, 4. But in looking at a population and how that population is evolving, the traits of the next generation are determined by essentially which individuals are reproducing and passing on their genes. And that's genetic traits. Later in the semester, we'll talk about this idea of indirect fitness too, which is very interesting, which means that you can increase your own fitness by helping your relatives care for their offspring. So you could be a helpful uncle or a helpful aunt or even a helpful brother or sister. And because you share genes with those other individuals that you're helping, then your genes are being passed on to the next generation because they have the same genes that you do. Anyway, so I hope, is that helpful with understanding fitness? About passing on genes.
Yeah, thanks.
It's graded on a curve too. The other question that we had, I think we've got fitness, genetic drift, and gene flow. Yeah, okay. Let's do this, people. Let's talk about genetic drift. This, I believe, is one of the harder concepts. And I hope you watch the lecture video because in the lecture video, that's where you're going to see the diagrams that I drew. And I hope you drew them along with me. The diagrams that show how if you start with a small population, then you don't get the benefit of having randomness of a process kind of be washed out by large sample size. If you are a person who has studied statistics, then I think this idea of genetic drift will be more easily understood because what we know about statistics is that if you only take a small sample, you're not likely to get a representation of all of the diversity that's out there, right? So let's look at, to examine genetic drift, which is a change in population allele frequencies. over time, over generations, due to chance, due to randomness. And essentially, this randomness is which alleles are going to get passed on to the next generation. Okay, the bottleneck effect is something that is very relevant to genetic drift because after a population has gone through a bottleneck, that population is susceptible to this genetic drift. So I'm going to use that to illustrate. What do we mean by the bottleneck effect? This happens when we have this big population, and this big population with a lot of genetic variation is dramatically reduced in size because of some event. So potentially a big wildfire goes through the forest and it wipes out most of the squirrels, for example, in that population. Or we have an example of elephant seals being hunted, and it's not really selection because they're just sitting there and the hunters are just firing at them. That's reduced their population a significant amount. When that bottleneck happens, the reason it's called a bottleneck is because if you look at this illustration, each of these marbles represents an allele. So genetic diversity right here. You can see this population has orange alleles, it has green alleles, it has purple alleles for this trait. So it's got some genetic variation going on there. And yeah, maybe the orange one is not as common as the other two, but it's still there, right? But after you reduce the size of that population significantly to only a few individuals, are you going to have that same amount of genetic variation? No, right? Some of that variation is going to be lost. So you end up with the surviving population that has lost some genetic variation. It doesn't have what it started with, but also it's a very small population. So, how is genetic drift relevant to this population that I'm looking at right here? What is one thing that could happen in the next generation that could dramatically alter this population with respect to these alleles? Remember, which of these alleles are going to get passed on? Kind of like, flipping a coin, whether the parent passes on the purple one or the green one. So what do you think is likely to happen in the next generation?
Genetic drift.
Right? Well, yeah, but what would that mean? In this, looking at this particular picture, does everybody see this picture where now we have a population that somehow has only 5 alleles, which, is not going to be the case, but it has 4 purple alleles and 1 green. So the frequency of that green allele is really, really low. There's only 1. Is it going to get passed on to the next generation? I see the look on your face, Christine, and you're like, is
I
it?
don't know. I don't. I mean, I get maybe. Well, I guess if it was dominant, if it wasn't dominant, then no, it wouldn't pass on.
It can still get passed on whether it's dominant or recessive, right?
Yeah.
Because it gets passed on to the children, to the offspring. But you're absolutely right. The answer is maybe,
Oh.
right? The
Mm.
answer is maybe and maybe not. But let's scale this up. So the frequency of the green allele right here in this population is 20%, right? 1 out of 5 alleles are green. So 20% is the frequency. But there are only 5 alleles in this population. So is it possible that if only 2 alleles get passed on, one of them is not going to be green? Yeah, right? Is it possible that several offspring could be produced and nobody gets the green allele? Yes. So that's what we mean by genetic drift being more powerful a force in small populations. If we were to scale this up and 20% of individuals in a population of 100 alleles, if 20% were green, that would mean you have a bowl and 20 of them are green and the rest are purple. And if you were just to take samples from that bowl, you're likely to get a green one because your samples are going to be much greater in that big population. But sample size is small in small populations, which leads to changes that are random changes due to genetic drift. And that's what genetic drift means. It's like, whoa, what's going to happen? We don't know. It's a random process. It could end up over here. It could end up over here. We could just completely lose that green allele altogether because of genetic drift. So we can contrast that with gene flow. And I think it's confusing because drift and flow seem to be very similar words. If you can somehow remember that that drift is referring to the role of chance and randomness in the process, whereas gene flow is the movement of individuals from one population to another, or the movement of even just gametes, because it could be that you have pollen in a plant and that pollen gets blown way, way, way far away. And so you have sperm from one population that ends up in a different population. So that's one way that you could get gene flow as well. Or just migration of individuals or like staying, either going and visiting and coming back or going and staying. That can lead to evolution in both the populations. In your lecture, the way that I explained this was, I'm going to go back and talk about what these diagrams mean here. When I first talked about in lecture the founder effect, it was in the context of genetic drift, because you often get genetic drift following a founder event. An example of a founder event is when you have this big population, let's say a big population that's from a continent, and some individuals from that population want to go out to sea and start a new population on an island in the ocean, right? So they will get on their boats and go and maybe do some exploring and then settle on an island somewhere. And this can happen on purpose or by accident, like maybe some birds get blown out to an island by heavy winds. When they get to these islands, now they are what are called founder populations, and they're much smaller populations, and they do not have the same amount of genetic diversity necessarily as that starting population had. And they're with these really small population sizes, they're now subject to those random effects of genetic drift, right? If they don't have a certain allele in a very high frequency, they might lose that allele completely just because of chance. That's genetic drift. But the other thing that can happen is that there could be movement of individuals. So say we have this population down here, and just the way it worked out, this population is completely full of individuals with this blue allele, and there are no red alleles in this population. It's possible, however, that an individual from a separate population can travel to this other population. And if that individual moves and immigrates into a different population, then they take their alleles with them. So that could potentially change the allele frequencies and makeup of the population they're going to, as well as the population they came from. Right? And that can lead to evolution, because evolution is the change in the genetic makeup of the population as a whole. This one's also like, I mean, I know it's kind of hard to imagine this, but there are some human populations for which we can really relate this principle of genetic drift and founder effect and even gene flow, because if you go to certain isolated, it's becoming less and less of a common thing in our species because we travel so easily from place to place. But if you go to a more isolated population and you look at the genetics of some of those populations, maybe sometimes that have been isolated on islands, you'll see that there are differences and that a lot of those differences have to do with genetic drift, that the individuals who settled just didn't have a certain allele, and that allele has never come to be part of that population. Or maybe they got a different allele because of mutation, which is another thing that can cause evolution in populations. So gene flow and genetic drift, you're just going to have to just keep talking about those, the difference there. Anybody have any questions about that?
I do have a question. I think it's kind of similar. But it is about number 11, but I think it's pretty simple. It just says, what are the 4 potential causes of evolution in populations? And on the slides, I think there was 5.
Yeah.
It included mutation, and I don't know if that's included, but yeah. I don't know.
Okay, so we could say 4 because there are 2 that are clumped together.
Oh, okay.
And what are the 2 that I kind of clumped together?
Genetic drift and mutation. Oh wait, why do I only have 4? Okay.
So is genetic drift a potential cause of evolution? Yep, right? Genetic drift for sure is. Is gene flow? Yep. Is mutation a cause of evolution in populations? Yes. So definitely genetic drift, definitely gene flow, definitely mutations. And then what's the other big one that we're studying in class, in lab this week? We'll also study it in lab next week.
Natural selection.
Natural selection. And so I think if there were 5 listed, the 5 that were listed were probably natural selection and sexual selection, right? So those 2, you could list those as 2 different processes because they work a little bit differently, but those are kind of clumped under like selection, right? So there's selection that can lead to evolution, and that's actually a process that is based on the traits and how well suited those traits are to that particular environment. So you would expect natural selection to result in adaptations, which is not to result in, I guess, adaptations kind of taking over the population, which means that the population as a whole is going to become more well suited to the environment. But all these other processes, genetic drift, gene flow, mutation, those are all processes that lead to evolution, but they do not lead to necessarily and any population being better suited to their environment. So they happen, but it's not a selective process. And in the lecture, I talked about the spiders that I had studied in Arizona and how gene flow actually was hurting the population because they kept getting this influx of individuals from different populations that were not well adapted to that particular environment. So these individuals kept showing up and they weren't well suited to that environment. So then natural selection would take place and kind of get things back to where it was, and then gene flow happens. So they all can contribute.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions, folks? Does anybody have any questions about the lecture assignments that we did or are doing? All right, I think that they're pretty straightforward. If you have any questions, of course, you can always ask. I also want to just put in a plug for our tutors who are available. Maddie is not going to be able to have her hours tomorrow, but she's available by email for questions as well. So I'll send out an announcement about that. Also, I don't have the histogram for exam 2 yet, but I have graded everybody's exam 2. So you should at this point be able to go into exam 2 and you can see what questions you got wrong and you can see the correct answers to those questions. And the average for exam 2 is in the mid 70s. So it's a lot better than it was for exam 1. Not quite 10 points higher, but almost 10 points higher. And exam 3 is coming up a couple weeks after spring break, right? So you have this week and then you have spring break, like this week, next week, spring break, and then a week for preparation for exam 3. So start looking forward to that. You all are on the right path doing these review questions. Anybody have any questions about the exam 2 and access to that? If you try to access those answers and you can't get them, please send me an email so I can fix that. One thing I want to highlight on here is it is really important for you all to understand how natural selection works. So you might get some challenging questions on the next exam that has to do with this, like how does this process work? And I think you should practice this by explaining the process to somebody who does not know how natural selection works. Work on a story that you can tell. Come up with a population. Describe the population. If it's an animal, what kind of animal is it? What species is it? Think about the variation that's present in that population with respect to a certain trait, right? If it's a population of bunnies, do some of the bunnies have brown fur and some of the bunnies have white fur? And that's the variation. Think about the environment. What is the environment like? Because the environment's so important here, right? Are these bunnies living in the snowy environment or are they living in a forest? Describe the environment and then ask your partner, say, okay, what do you think is going to happen? Which of these bunnies are going to survive and be more likely to reproduce and pass on their genes to the next generation? And if it's a snowy environment, they might say, well, probably the white ones because the background is white and they're going to blend in and not be eaten by predators. But in the forest, it's going to be the brown ones, right? So then think about what the next generation is going to look like because of that differential survival and reproduction. That is how natural selection works. It's this process. You have to have genetic variation. So you have to have variation in traits, right? You have to have differential survival and reproduction. So not every individual is equally likely to survive and reproduce. And that difference in likelihood is based on the environment, based on the selective pressures. And in the next generation, the ones that reproduce, that passed on their genes, that's the trait that's going to be represented most heavily in the next generation. And it just keeps going and going and going. There's a handout that I encourage you to look at, which you don't really have to get this handout because everything that's in this handout was also on the lecture slides. But it's just neatly packaged in this little handout here. I used to give it out in class so that students would just have it to look at. You've got everything digitally now, but you can also see Darwin's observations and Darwin's inferences, and an inference is a conclusion based on evidence. So Darwin had evidence for all of these other things, right? That there's variation, not all individuals are the same. And that those traits are to a large extent based on genes. So they're passed from generation to generation. That more individuals are born than can survive and reproduce, right? That there's an overproduction of offspring in a lot of populations. It's not always the case, but in most populations, if everybody's reproducing to their full capacity, then the environment is not going to be able to support that. So there's going to be some struggle for existence because of competition. And if everyone in the population is competing for the same resources, the outcome of a competition is going to be winners and losers, right? Those who survive and thrive and those who don't get the resources that they need the ones that are surviving and thriving in that environment are more likely to pass on their genes. And then reproduction is also very important there, right? They're going to pass on their genes so that over time, the individuals in the population are all descendants of those survivors, right? That had the traits that were good in that environment. So those adaptive traits are going to be more abundant in the population over generations. And that could go on for a long, long time. But then if there's a change in the environment, uh-oh, maybe a different trait is adaptive. So it can go like that. And sometimes it does. Does everybody feel good about things for now?
Yeah,
Okay.
good. Thanks.
Huh?
Good. Thanks.
Okay, good. Yeah. Good work. And I'll see you either this afternoon for a lab review or next week.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
folks. Thank you.
See you.